Okay, so this question is on what is the difference between being drunk and an alcoholic? Now, this question was originally posted on Reddit, and I'm not sure whether the original poster intended that it was the difference between being a drunk and being an alcoholic. However, we'll take it as it is literally. So the question is, what's the difference between being drunk and an alcoholic? Well, the difference between the two of them is that one is a state of being, in other words, drunk or intoxicated, and the other one, the alcoholic, is a behavioral label. The so-called alcoholic can also be in a state of intoxication or drunkenness. So, depending on how you look at it, the two terms could be interchangeable. The problem with labels, if we're labeling somebody a drunk or an alcoholic, they don't help the individual because they bring up judgment and shame, and labeling somebody is always counterproductive. And it's one of our biggest fears when we try and give up drinking and somebody cottons on, they judge you. They sort of think, oh, he has to give up drinking. Maybe he's or she is an alcoholic, right? And that's scary to people, being judged as an alcoholic or being judged as the town drunk. There's all that shame and stuff that comes with that, and the visuals. Somebody that's totally lost control of their alcohol use. Might be living on the street, might be living in really squalid conditions. But often, the perception is different to the reality. The alcoholic is said not to be able to control their drinking and needs alcohol above everything else every day. Above their own needs, their family's needs, and their life, basically. There's no real relevance, though, in the medical world. Like, you can't go to the doctor and say, Doc, can you diagnose of whether I'm an alcoholic or not? They'll turn around and say, well, that's up to you. How do you feel? What do you think? They have no manual that says, this, and this, tick, 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 tick. Yes, you're an alcoholic, right? It's termed alcohol use disorder, which is really a spectrum of drinking behaviors. And we often hear things like binge drinker, dry drunk, alcoholic, drunk drunk, and everything in between. Grey area drinker is another one. They're all kind of on a spectrum and they all describe different kinds of behavior. And often they are labels that end up judging people. And, if you're being judged by someone, how do you feel? Do you feel good about that? Probably not. Because there's going to be those people that can drink heavily and still function normally. So they can hold jobs, they can keep their family together, they have a home, and so on. And they might actually consider themselves a normal drinker, but somebody else sort of looking in might think, well, that guy's almost an alcoholic, the amount of stuff he puts away. But yet, he doesn't display all the perception ideas that we have about what an alcoholic looks like or how they behave. Somebody who does drink heavily and the circumstances around their drinking has led them to be isolated and alone, they could be living on the street or they could be trapped in their own home with their drug of choice, alcohol. So alcohol itself is addictive. And here's the truth, any human being on this planet can be addicted to alcohol and can end up in circumstances like that, like living on the street, being isolated in the home. Also, the idea of being only normal drinkers or alcoholic drinkers is a fallacy. This binary view of things, black and white. Either you're a normal drinker or you're an alcoholic. Well, no in between. But the truth of it is, the spectrum or the sliding scale, and if we keep drinking more and more over time, addiction becomes inevitable, right? Alcohol is addictive. Some people will be addicted sooner than others, some may never get there. And there's going to be many factors that determine the likelihood of that. For example, somebody that's suffered trauma in their life and they're drinking for the relief of that trauma, whether they realize it or not, may become addicted relatively quickly compared to somebody who spends a few hours in the pub every week. Now, if we put an A in that question, what's the difference between a drunk and an alcoholic? Well, there's none because they're both labels. And as I said before, there's no medical definition that a doctor can look up for you that says, oh, yes, you meet all this criteria, tick, 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 you're a drunk. You meet this other criteria over here, tick, 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 yes, you're an alcoholic. Doesn't happen. And I've never heard anybody say, oh, that person's a drunk because they drink 10 units of alcohol a day, and that one over there, they're an alcoholic because they drink 20 units a day. I've never seen that in a book or in a document, a video, anything. The labels could be considered interchangeable, but as I said before, nobody is served by a label. Compassionate and understanding and knowing that the person is suffering from an addiction that they cannot control is what they need. It isn't their fault that they are addicted, and we should help them where we can to understand what that is and for them to take responsibility for their predicament. Okay, I hope that answers your question.